Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Welcome to day 2 of the 2024 updates to the Super Circular under NAHASDA given by Vince Franco. I'm Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist at the Native Learning Center. We're all happy you guys could join us for this 2-day virtual training. Just some important notes. If you haven't already, please change your name and teams to your first and last name. Makes it a lot easier for us to go through and mark attendance and get our data. If you're not registered for the training just yet, or maybe you're viewing as a group of people, if you could just let us know in the chat so that we can get everybody registered and make sure everyone's accounted for. And we say all that because only registered attendees are going to receive these certificates of completion. So we want to just make sure that we're getting those out to everybody. And if you need any extra assistance, my email is right there on the slide. You can actually click on that directly and start an email draft if you need to. Just a quick disclaimer before we get going. This virtual training provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted session format. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law printed here. So just a reminder that the virtual training materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. While we are on the topic of the training materials, I did send y'all a link to a page on our website where you can download both the presentation itself as well as the many resource items that Vince had prepared for you. So if you just follow that link that I sent into the chat, I'll send it again. That'll take you again to our website, and all those materials are available for download. So I'm going to send that in the chat one more time. Here we go. All right, as you guys are joining, if you could just take a second to mute your mics so that we can avoid any sound feedback. And we encourage you to participate through the chat as well as using reactions. So in order to use that, if you don't have your chat already open, you can go up to the top of your screen and there's a little chat bubble and it'll say chat. If you click on that, it'll expand to your right-hand side. If you want to send anything, you'll just click where it says type a message, type in whatever you want to say, questions, comments, anything like that, and you can send it into the chat. Earlier when I brought up attendance and making sure everybody's accounted for, this is where you could let us know if you're sitting as a group or if you're on and you know you're not registered. You'll just type your message and then you can click on that little paper airplane, or you could just hit enter and it'll go into the Teams chat and we can all see it. If you want to raise your hand, there's a little hand icon up at the top of your screen and it says raise beneath it. You can just use that to draw attention to yourself. Maybe if you've sent a comment or a question into the chat and it went unnoticed, you could use it for that. And then you can show some reactions as Vince is going through his content. You could do a like, a love, applause, laughter, surprise, and those little icons will just pop up briefly on the bottom of the screen by your name. When we get towards the end, probably the final break that you guys take, we are going to ask that you turn your cameras on for a little bit so that we could do a group photo. I didn't do it until the very end yesterday, and I think we lost out on a lot of people who would have otherwise maybe been in it. So today we're going to try to remember to do it on the final break that you guys take. You're going to be taking some quick breaks at the top of every hour so everyone can have a chance to get a drink, go to the restroom, whatever you need. All right, that's all I have for you guys for the introduction. If you could please get the chat going, greet one another, let us know your name, where you're joining us from, tribal affiliation, and the job that you have that's probably brought you here today. All right, Vince, if you want to go ahead and take over and start sharing the slides where you left off yesterday, I am all done with the intro.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Brooke. We'll see you again in a little bit when we close. So let me go ahead and get right into it. Welcome, everybody. I am going to share my screen with you, hopefully. All right, so far so good. And let me go full screen now. Good, okay. Now, hopefully you can see what I see. And that is highlights for updates to the uniform guidance under NAHASDA, OMB's uniform guidance regulations, 2 CFR Part 200, super circular. And what we're going to be talking about today which is day 2 of 2, is subparts D, E, and F. Yesterday, we talked about subparts A, B, and C, and statutory requirements and a little bit of introductory info. So on the left side of the screen, you see what we talked about yesterday. That whole column on the left. In the early afternoon, we talked about part 1, highlights of, I went into some grant management, actually some grant writing, a little bit grant writing and grant management, terms and conditions. Self-monitoring was a big topic yesterday, record retention, and also at the very bottom, regulatory and compliance. We got into a little bit of a deep dive into internal controls, which we'll do again today because it's part and parcel of the discussion in Subpart D. But yesterday, in the late afternoon, we finished up, or the second half, so to speak, got into the bottom left of the agenda there, statutory requirements, the 6 statutory requirements that are built into the uniform guidance. We also talked about Subpart A, which was the definitions, and went through to make sure everyone understand the nomenclature. Everyone would hopefully understand the terms and phrases that the Office of Management and Budget, the federal agencies use on a regular basis for federal grants. And again, just to remind you, if you receive any kind of federal grant, you're going to be in a situation where you'll have to abide by the rules contained in the uniform guidance, also called the 2 CFR Part 200, which is how I usually refer to it. And also, as Brooke had mentioned, it's sometimes referred to as the super circular. That was the original kind of a nickname. I call it the street name that was given to the uniform guidance back around 2014 when this whole thing came together and they consolidated all the original citations into one master document. They called it the super circular. It made sense. That phrase is kind of going out of style now. It's been 8, 9, almost 10 years now since they actually created the uniform guidance. And there's been several generations. There's been several upgrades to it over the past 10 years. One just recently, which I've been trying to integrate into the discussion, pointing out where the regulations are right now and how they're changing and what significance that might or might not have to your particular operation. I've been kind of pointing those out. And I'll do the same as we continue here today. Now, yesterday we did the definitions. We also did Subpart B on the bottom left there, general provisions, and we got into all of Subpart C. B and C of the federal regulations of the uniform guidance really are geared towards the federal agencies and not so much for us as recipients of federal funds. But we, as grant managers, as program directors, as compliance people, we need to be aware of what the agencies are being told to do and what their marching orders are, where their directions are pointing them to, and how those mandates from Congress and from the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, what those mandates are to the agency and how they trickle down to us. Where do some of these regulations come from? Why are we forced to do some of these things? Getting a good understanding in the general provisions of what the agencies are and Subpart C, pre-award requirements, is, I think, part and parcel of understanding kind of the big picture. And remember also, I was talking about the goal here is to help you, by the time we're done here, help you to be able to better navigate, search, interpret, and implement these regulations, either the existing regulations and or the new regulations coming up. Because once you do that, once you have a good understanding and a skill set of how to navigate through here, I think it'll really help you in interpreting some of the vague citations that are built into these regulations. Some of them really don't tell us or guide us how to do certain things. We are forced to do it ourselves. And that's what I'm going to point out a few of those things as we move through parts D, E, and F, mostly in D and E, how we can interpret these vague regulations to be able to meet the letter of the law and still protect our program, and even more so, adjust or adapt, adopt, whatever phrase you want to use here, these regulations to fit our program. That is something, that's a higher level of thinking. That is something we need to try to do. And the only way we can do that is to have a good understanding of the big picture here with regulations before we start breaking things down. So that was all yesterday. Today, we're going to do the top right primarily, subparts D, E, and F. The bulk of our time will be spent going over those citations built into those subparts of the uniform guidance. If we have time, I'll touch on part 4 and the very bottom there, the appendixes. But we'll be talking about that as we go through. So by the time, if I do this correctly, by the time I get to part 4, we really have gone over internal controls thoroughly. The 3 most important parts of internal controls: operation, financial activities, and compliance. So we'll make a judgment call when we get to that point. We might just stop there because everything else would be repetition. Hopefully so. Hopefully we've covered this part 3 here coming up sufficiently. Okay, so let's get going. And as Brooke said, if you have any questions or comments or concerns, put them out there, either in the chat box or raise a hand or unmute yourself for a minute. Put that question or concern out there, because I'd rather deal with it in real time to the best of my ability with reasonable assurance. Remember that phrase from yesterday? Then wait till the end. You might forget what your question is if you're forced to wait an hour or two. And I'd rather deal with them kind of here and there as we go instead of stockpiling them at the end. Okay. Sir, or a poll, more or less. Brooke, I need you help a little bit and keeping an eye on this. Hopefully everyone will participate. How familiar are you with the actual internal controls, from a requirement standpoint and from a practical standpoint, your own policies and procedures, as well as the self-monitoring process? A, really not aware of these terms and the conditions of them as mandatory requirements. B, I've heard of them, but don't know the details. C, I know the processes, I'm familiar with them, and I know the requirements, but could learn a little bit more. And then D, I'm kind of the resident expert. I could actually, teach a little bit on this. My educated guess is the bulk will fall into B and C. We might have a couple D's in there, and we might even have a couple A's.
It's about half C's alone, and then the other half is mixed between A, B, and D.
Okay, well, you're all in the right place. Those of you that answered D, you might know this information. This might be a little bit of a refresher for you, and from a different perspective. So maybe there's something to learn there. For the rest of you, the B's and the C's here that know, maybe you've heard of it, or you want to get exposed to it, you're in the right place. We'll try to do that to the best of my ability. Present this to you in a format that is easy to understand federal regulations as could be. And those of you who marked A, well, thank you very much for being honest. Again, you're in the right place, and hopefully you'll walk out of this presentation with a little more knowledge of these federal regulations. So we're going to jump right into subpart D, which is actually the 4th part. We did A, B, and C. This is D. This is referred to as the post-federal award requirements. Now we're talking about the mandatory requirements that are mandated of us, required of us as recipients of federal funds. And there's a little bit of that, activity here on the federal agencies and their involvement. So I'm just going to walk through subpart D here. Now, if you're familiar with the uniform guidance as I am, we refer to subpart D as the 300s. We did the zeros, that was the definition. We did the 1 to 99, that was subpart A. B was the 100s. Subpart C was the 200s, and now we're getting into 300s, 400s, and the 500s. Okay, in other words, subpart D, E, and F. So we're going to be looking at 2 CFR part 200.300 through 3, trying to do this by memory, 345 or so. So we'll just kind of walk through here, and I'll point out the areas of the citations of particular concern. This first one, statutory national policy requirement, states that the non-federal entity, NFE, that's us as federal funding recipients, we are collectively responsible for complying with all the requirements of the federal award. It's just stated right there. We are obligated to do that. And I don't want to confuse you too much with this, with the bottom end of the bottom. Let's take this in 2 stages. Let's look at the requirement at the top, and then give me a second to try to explain the bottom. 301, 2 CFR Part 200.301, performance measurement. Yesterday, if you were with me, you heard me talk a little bit about how the Office of Management and Budget, which is the parent agency, giving mandates to all the federal agencies saying you need to transition more and more into performance-based activities of your funding recipients. So they were receiving, if we went back into the 200s, and that would have been subpart C, we could look at the agency's mandate to move in this direction, move away from paper, move toward electronic data records, also at the same time move more and more towards data collection, data performance, and performance management as a whole. So that's what the regulation for us is here in 301. Performance measurement requires us as entities to relate financial data to performance accomplishment more and more and more, and provide more cost information and demonstrate cost effectiveness. This is the trend that we're moving in, and some agencies are more aggressive in implementing this than others. The screen below that, the little matrix, or the big matrix actually, below that is what's referred to as a logic model. If we were talking about grant writing, I'd be spending a lot of time discussing how to create goals that are measurable, smart goals, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and tangible. That's the way we're moving with our federal funding, being able to generate smart goals, as you can see there in the second column to the left, goals that are measurable and attainable, that generate short-term outcomes that are specific, and long-term results that are measured as a percentage increase or decrease, depending upon what we're trying to do. We are moving more and more towards a data-driven scenario, like you see here with the logic model process. Grant writers deal with this all the time. So if you're interested to learn more about grant writing, this is the kind of stuff that we talk about in that, the logic model process, developing goals that are measurable, attainable, and being able to evaluate at any time where you are in the grant process. But you can't evaluate unless you have measurable goals. So we spend a lot of time in grant writing talking about this. We spend a little time in grants management talking about it. And for sake of this training program, which is the regulations and the updates to the regulations, I'm putting this specific citation in front of you that talks about it. We are moving in this direction. So I want you to just circle this one, keep this in mind as we progress in the program, and we're getting, looking for funding and perhaps even looking for grant writing for federal funds, that we are moving in this direction more and more. All right, so that's 301. 302 and 302 is where the bread and butter of one of the 2 or 3 really important citations in subpart D. This one and the next one for sure. Circle this one and circle the next one. So I'm going to hover here for a minute and talk about 2 CFR Part 200, 302, financial management. Here's the citation. It requires us to have a financial system in place. It must provide the following, and there's 6 bullet points there. First of all, identification of all financial or all federal awards received. That makes sense. 2, accurate, current, complete disclosure of financial activities for each federal award using generally accepted accounting principles, which is a normal practice, best practice, actually. Third thing that this regulation requires, records that identify the source and the application of the federally funded activities. Number 4, effective control. This is a phrase you want to circle, you want to, make sure you understand. The regulation is saying we have to be able to demonstrate in our internal controls, in our policies and procedures, and in our actual financial activities that we have effective control and accountability, and let's put another word in there, transparency for all funds and all property and all assets that fall under that grant, that federal grant, using generally accepted accounting practices, using your own policies and procedures. 5th bullet, comparison of expenditures with budget. I'm sure your accounting people do that. A year ago today, current expenditures and a comparison between the two. And the bottom two, probably the most important, written procedures. That's your policies and procedures that fall underneath your internal controls. And the bottom one, here it is again, documentation on every procurement. I said that because we saw this statement verbatim, documentation on every procurement, earlier in another citation that had nothing to do with financial management. It was in Subpart C, but it talked about, and we talked about it yesterday afternoon, that every single procurement must have documentation. It's mentioned over and over and over. And then I showed you a little conflict that exists. The federal regulations are full of conflicts and vague citations. The vague one's coming up next, which I'll show you. But this one is very clear. Document on every procurement, regardless of what you hear. This is the mandate that we have. Okay, so that's 2 CFR Part 200, 302 financial management. All right, kind of specific. Doesn't tell you exactly how to do it because you're going to fall back on generally accepted accounting practices, and you're going to fall back onto your own internal policies and procedures. This next one is of significance. This is the citation that tells us we've got to have internal controls. And in my opinion, it's one of the shorter citations of all the regulations, but it's the one that carries the most, in my opinion, the most impact to us as the operators, as the project managers, as the grants managers of our program, wherever we are, with a tribe or a nonprofit or whatever. And it's vague. So let's walk through it real quick, because what you see on the screen, that's it. That's all it says. So 2 CFR Part 200, 303 internal controls requires us as the funding recipient to establish and maintain effective internal control over the federal award that provides, there's that phrase, reasonable assurance. Remember, I talked about that phrase yesterday. That's the federal government phrase for, and you could substitute almost verbatim, to the best of our ability, or to the best of your ability. That's what reasonable assurance means, because nothing's perfect, nothing's 100%. Thank God they recognize that, and we should be using that phrase. As you can see over on the left, it's a little screenshot of the Native Learning Center's Seminole Tribes procurement guidelines, and right very first sentence in our policies and procedure, it quotes this statement. It says, if you can't read it, it says procurement guidelines, 2 CFR Part 200, 303 internal controls requires that the Native Learning Center, which is the recipient of Indian Housing Block Grant funds, to establish and maintain effective controls over the federal award that provides reasonable assurance. It's even highlighted in yellow in our internal controls that the NALC is managing the federal awards in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the federal award. Then it goes into the particulars of the Native Learning Center below that. Approval and signatures and everything below that are unique to the Native Learning Center and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. But back over on the right, looking at the actual citation, it uses that term, reasonable assurance, that the non-federal entity is managing its award in compliance, et cetera, et cetera. Second bullet there, comply with this. It's kind of redundant. It repeats the first one to some extent in different verbiage. Comply with statutes. In our case, that would be NAHASDA and the regulations. That's 2 CFR Part 200, and the terms and conditions of the award itself. Okay, it's kind of reinforcing the first bullet. Then the bottom one there, which is relatively new that it's only about a year and a half old, maybe 2 years old, and that is what's referred to as PII, personally identifiable information. It says safeguard all protected personal identifiable information, which is going to be different depending upon the type of activity you do, the type of award you get. But all of us, in one way or another, all of our programs collect information and data from our customers, whether they're tribal members or outside the tribe. We're collecting information from them and data in some cases. We need to know what that information and data is. Is it a social security number? Is it a date of birth or a marital status, gender, home address, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? What is that identifiable information? And not only what is it, how do we protect it? I talked a little bit about this yesterday. If it's a paper document, you probably got to keep it in some kind of a locked box or locked filing system, literally. Keep it in there. And if it's electronic, which is where we're supposed to be moving electronic record keeping, then it needs to be put somewhere on your mainframe system or somewhere, your software system, a dedicated drive on that system, perhaps, with limited access by a few number of staff people that have limited capacity to get in there and manipulate the information. Not only do you literally have to have those safeguards in place because they're mandated, you also, within this same citation, need to have policies and procedures that describe that, what I just told you, that describe it. That falls underneath your internal controls. So let's look at this from a different standpoint. I look at this, you might look at this and go, wow, we've got to have, at least I look at it this way, we've got to have internal controls. We've got to have reasonable assurance we're doing everything correctly. We've got to put this in writing. We've got to have everything covered. How do we do that? Because it doesn't tell you, does it? It doesn't say step 1, step 2, step 3, do this, do that. It doesn't. It just says in the prior citation, follow generally accepted accounting practices, do your financial activities properly, follow all the proper protocols, et cetera. It doesn't really tell you how to do it there either. And it certainly doesn't tell you here how to actually develop your internal controls, how to develop your policies and procedures, how to implement them, how to monitor and evaluate them. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It just says you have to do it. So the only way, in my opinion, that you can really do this citation, this mandate properly in the prior one, is to have a full understanding of big picture, as I was mentioning a few minutes before. Being able to navigate, search, interpret, and implement these citations. And the only way to do that is practice, exposing yourself, getting in like you're doing here today, going through these citations, learning how to navigate, and learning the verbiage, the nomenclature, the hierarchy of all these citations, and get a better understanding. That's really the only way, and the best way to get a good understanding. So then once you go through this and get a good understanding how to navigate and search interpret, and implement, then you can go back and take a look at your internal controls, take a look at your operation and your financial activities and your compliance, and make sure that they are up to speed and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So let's continue on. I always stop on this one because it's one of the smaller, it's not the biggest citation. There's several citations much more comprehensive than this. But this one I think carries the most impact because it tells us how we're supposed to treat our entire program, our federal funds, everything. This is how we're supposed to treat it, but it doesn't tell us how to do it. And that's the frustrating part, right? So we're going to learn how to do it the hard way, so to speak. Well, I'm going to make it the easy way, but there's no quick. I wish I could wave a wand or snap my fingers and give you, a cheat sheet of one page of this. You do this, do that, do this, and you're done, and you'll understand. It's not that simple. It's much more complicated. There's a lot of moving parts to these regulations. You have to be methodical in what you do. You've got to be able to evaluate and monitor not only your compliance, but your operation and your financial activities. You've got what you see on the screen is, all those arrows up there are just some examples of policies and procedures that would fall under your internal controls. On the left, you've got conduct and conflict of interest. I think we talked about that earlier. And several others there: confidentiality, nepotism, financial management, procurement, Indian and tribal preference, attendance for housing, attendance for work, not just for housing, but work-related, termination, also work-related. And over on the right, more work-related policies, hirings, rehirings, performance management. Performance management, just like I was talking a moment ago about the agency moving more towards data collection, so is performance management. That's moving right along with the grant scenario. Everything being data driven. We're moving in that direction too, for performance management of our employees. Employee benefits, disciplinary, there's a whole slew of different things there. And at the very, very bottom there, it says work environment guidelines. That is a screenshot of the Native Learning Center. I think I did one just a moment ago. This is another screenshot out of the Native Learning Center's internal controls document. Just a quick screenshot of work guidelines, 1.1 code of conduct, and right underneath that conflicts of interest. So they address that right away, and you can see at the top right, there's that phrase again, reasonable assurance. That is the phrase that starts the very first paragraph of every subsection of the Native Learning Center's internal controls document, which has 13 different chapters covering every facet of operation, financial activities, and compliance that they do, because we have to do this in some kind of logical format. Here's a little bit more on some of the policies, but now these are more program related, more program driven. NAHASDA, rent and homeowner payment. Now we're over on the housing side. Eligibility, admissions and occupancy, EA&Os, that's referred to sometimes, management and maintenance, tenants and homeowner selection, and so on. So just a sample of different policies and more. Here's a few more also policy, just suggestions on different policies, internal controls, housing standards, rental assistance, and so on. Just wanted to show you. So we have policies and procedures that apply to operation. We have policies and procedures that apply to financial activities, and we have policies and procedures that apply to compliance. Now, within the operation and financial activities, you maybe have some subdivisions like housing. That's why I had some of these policies and procedures up there. All right, back to the uniform guidance subpart B. We're just getting started here in fact, let me do this. We're at the top of the hour. I don't want these breaks to get by me, and it's easy for me to do once I get rolling here. Why don't we take a break here? and I'll come back and we'll keep going. Some of this we've already talked about here yesterday, but let's take a break and come back at 10 after the hour. So for here on the East Coast, it would be 2:10, 1:10 in Central Time, and so on. All right, see you in 5. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's keep going here. I've got a lot of ground to cover. I talked a little bit about this yesterday, and here it is specifically in Subpart D, 2 CFR Part 200, 306, cost sharing or matching. I mentioned that with the new revision to the uniform guidance to the 2 CFR Part 200, they're dropping the word matching. The feds don't like that phrase or word. The citation still applies. All federal awards, any shared costs, funds for all contributions, cash, third party or in-kind contributions must be accepted if the grant requires a cost share. Just make a note of that. It's not a big deal, but it's one of those things that they're phasing it out like super circular. They're phasing out this phrase matching. They don't like it. So that's it. And let me point something else out here. By the way, when I'm going through, usually when we have a citation highlighted in red, like we do here and like we do on this one coming up, that means these are the ones I want to focus on most. So some of them are just not highlighted in red, but the ones in red have something going on that I think is important. There might be a change, like program income, 2 CFR Part 200, 307. May want to circle that. Generally encourage entities to earn income using federal funds to generate the equivalent of a profit center. And here in the yellow box in particular, I want to point this out. They're expanding program income, which is to our benefit in this case, clarifying the use and expending expenditures, including allowing program income for certain closeout costs. That's something you couldn't do before with your program income, and more clarification. So you want to if you're interested, take a deeper dive into 200 307 and learn more about how to generate program income, how to use it effectively. Generally, here's one of those situations where just because the uniform guidance, the 2 CFR Part 200 says you can do it, doesn't necessarily mean that you can do it for each and every federal grant, if you know what I mean. Now, under the Indian Housing Block Grant, which is HUD's federal funding for housing, you could do it. They would allow you to do it. So here, in that case, the agency was in sync with the federal guidelines. I can't speak for all the other agencies out there and all the other federal awards. It's something you'll have to, if you're interested in trying to generate program income from using some of your federal funds, make sure that the specific grant allows you to do it and the agency allows you to do it. And I don't want you to run into a situation where, it says we can do it. Well, yeah, the federal guidelines say you can do it, but the devil's in the details here. You got to see if the agency would allow you to do it. We're going to run into scenarios like this as we go through the program where the uniform guidance says, yeah, you can do this, but it all depends on if you have money in your budget, if you don't have a tribal protocol that goes against it, or it just doesn't make sense for you, or the agency itself has doesn't allow you to do it. So you've got to make sure you understand the parameters. Program income is one of those areas. Okay, revision. No, that's not really too much going on here. Modification period performance, now insurance, now equipment. I alluded to this yesterday. This is a big one, equipment and supplies. 2 CFR Part 200 313 and its next door neighbor 314. Equipment and supplies. Threshold equipment more than supplies has changed. I know you're familiar with equipment. Must be used by the recipient in the program or project for which it was acquired for. Okay, that makes sense. Now, over on the right, we've got some changes that I want you to be aware of with the revision to the uniform guidance. At the very top, it says the threshold has changed, moving up from 5,000 to 10,000, which means theoretically, you might not have to get into all the activity and all the costs involved with the depreciating a piece of equipment that was valued at $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000. Now the threshold is 10,000 or more, which would mean that once that thing that was considered equipment might now be considered a supply, and you do not have to depreciate it, and you save your accounting department a lot of time and energy and cost associated with depreciating equipment. So you might want to take a deeper dive and you want to circle this one and the next one, supplies. There's been some change here. The second bullet there on the right in yellow allows tribes to dispose of used equipment or any equipment, whether it's used or new, in accordance with tribal law. Currently, until the revision came through, it said that if you want to dispose of equipment, and that's what it's called, disposition of equipment, disposition of equipment. If you wanted to dispose of it, for example, sell it, there were some strings attached to that. Monies that were generated from the sell of that equipment would have to go back to the funding source, and it got complicated. Now, what they're talking about in that second bullet is allowing you to dispose of the equipment, sell it, give it away, whatever, without getting the federal agency involved. In other words, as it says there, in accordance with tribal law. So, that kind of frees you up to be able to get rid of very expensive equipment that's depreciated to zero, perhaps, but it's still got a market value. You could sell it and recover those costs. So I think that's in our favor. I want you to circle this one because as the actual citations come out, and certainly by October 1st, this should be fleshed out even more. All right, the third and fourth bullet talk more about that depreciation of equipment. Supplies is the next one. Like its twin, equipment 313, 314 supplies, that threshold has also or will also increase from 5,000 to 10,000. All right. So keep an eye on that, circle that one. What used to be considered equipment because its value was more than $5,000, maybe it was 6,000 or 7,000, you had, because of its dollar value, you had to consider it to be equipment. Now it can be treated as a supply, at least theoretically. That opens up the door for more and more things that used to be equipment and you had to depreciate their value now can be a supply. Supplies are considered, just like in the grocery store, they have a very short shelf life, much less than equipment that has a very long shelf life or life expectancy, so to speak. Okay, we talked about intangible property yesterday. That's our software, native learning center. It would be curriculum like what you see here, training program designed for tribes on federal regulations. That's intangible property that's owned by the Seminole Tribe of Florida in this case. So software is another one that could be, if you could put a value on it, and we can, then it's intangible property and it's considered an asset. Okay, let's keep going. These are some areas I'm not really going to get into, but in 1 second here we go. Here's another, along with equipment and supplies and internal controls, Subpart D also contains all the provisions on procurement. It starts here. 2 CFR Part 200, 318, 319, and then the next one on the next slide, 320, which I'll get into in a minute. All right, the mandated regulations here in the federal regulations, 2 CFR Part 200, 318, you can see it right in front of you. General procurement standards must have written procedures. That's your internal controls. Again, stated again in another citation, 318, this time instead of 303, must contain oversight. That was clear in the 303, and must deliver. There's a word missing in that third bullet. must eliminate eliminate the acquisition of unnecessary or duplicate items. Okay. We want to keep that in mind. Okay. Tribes are allowed to use their own policies and procedures. Even though that seems kind of a mundane or ridiculous kind of a statement, obviously the Office of Management and Budget has it in there because there must have been some confusion. But what they're saying is you follow your own procedures, and your procedures, of course, have to follow the statutes and these regulations that we're going over, but you also follow your tribal protocols and procedures as much as you do the federal regs. Okay, that's 318, pretty straightforward. 319 says competition. All procurement transactions must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition, transparency, whether you're doing sealed bid, competitive sole source, which we'll get into in a minute. You must document the fact that you were non-discriminatory, that you were competitive in every way, shape, or form, you were transparent, and with reasonable assurance, there's that phrase, you were doing everything within your power to stay in sync with the federal regulations, right? That's what it's saying here, competition. All right, here's where the regs get into the actual methods of procurement, okay? We talked a little bit about this yesterday, I'll get to it, between the two informal processes and the 3 or 4 formal processes of procurement. And what you see in front of you, starting with sealed bids, is part of what they consider to be the formal process. So let me go through it real quick and point out some things you may or may not be aware of. Sealed bid is a regular process that's allowed primarily for construction related things, for the recruitment and selection of a general contractor, for example. That's typically what it's used for. It can be used for other things, but that's primarily what it's used for. It says in order for a sealed bid to be used, the following conditions must be present. These are not my words. These are the words of the federal guidelines. Must have a description, must have 2 or more what they refer to as responsible bidders. Now, here's another phrase that you want to make note of or circle. Responsible bidder. What is a responsible bidder? They don't tell us. The regs don't tell you what is a responsible bidder because it's too personal. It's too dependent upon where you are and what you're trying to do and the folks that you're dealing with. A responsible bidder to me is one that provides timely service with a quality product. Those 2 things primarily. Timely service, they're on time, they don't drag things out. You can count on them to deliver when they say they're going to deliver a product or service, and it's a quality product. And if it's not, then they're not a responsible bidder. It goes on, number 3 down there, the procurement lends itself to a fixed price contract. Yeah, sealed bids are kind of that way. Let's keep going. If the sealed bid is used, the following requirements apply. There must be some kind of an invitation, or as it's referred to, request for proposal, RFP, RFQ, request for quote. Those are the types of invitations we're talking about here. Must be publicly advertised. Bids must be solicited from, here's another vague phrase, adequate number of known suppliers. Adequate number, vague, right? Mark that, adequate. What's an adequate number? And secondly, a known supplier. A known supplier. So we got 2 things here. 2 things that are kind of vague. They don't give us a definition of adequate, and they don't give us a definition of known. So the question is, can you have a short list of suppliers or vendors that you would send an invitation to bid using an RFP process? The short answer is yes. If you have a list of vendors, whether it's for a sealed bid or competition, that deliver a timely, quality product, yeah, that's going to be your go-to. Adequate number, that is so open. They don't tell us what adequate number is. I think that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. So those are two phrases you want to circle here. Adequate number and known supplier with sufficient response time. Okay. The invitate, and then it goes on to give you details. But I want to fix your eyes on the bottom there regarding not just sealed bids, but all procurement, responsive and responsible bidder. That's another phrase that I want you to kind of burn into your memory if you can and circle it, because these are the Fed's words. And what they're saying here is you don't, if you're going to go with we typically go with the lowest bidder, right? I mean, that's the goal. What they're saying here is, yeah, you're going to go with the lowest bidder, but you're going to go with the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. So here we are again talking about vendors or bidders that have a proven track record of timely delivery and quality service that meets your unique needs. Now, those are the exact words that I would say. If you haven't noticed, I'm kind of segueing into interpretation here. I'm taking their regulations and the vagueness that I see in them, and I'm trying to manipulate is not the right word, but I'm trying to work with them to fit my procurement standards for my tribe or my organization. Adequate number is not defined, known supplier is not defined, and at the bottom, responsive and responsible bidder is not defined. They're leaving us to come up with a description of what that means for us, and then meet the letter of the law, adequate number, known supplier, responsive and responsible bidder, but do it in a way that fits our needs. That makes sense? That is how I'm interpreting this particular regulation to work. I'm going to not always suggest going with the lowest bidder if I know the product is not quality, or if the vendor has a track record and a horrible history of delays, etc. That is not the lowest responsible and responsive bidder. So those are ways that you could interpret, in this particular citation, and work with the letter of the law and make it work, make it work for the unique needs of your organization. Second one, when we get beyond sealed bids, we've got, well, RFP could be included in there, but proposals, that's a second of the formal processes that the uniform guidance recognize. Then the third one, probably the most prevalent, is competitive procurement. And that's probably 80%. 80% of your procurement is probably competitive. It was for us, with 80% competitive, 10% being sealed bid, and 10% being the one I'm going to show you next, sole source. But the bulk of our procurement, probably the bulk of your procurement, is competitive. Now, we've seen it 3, 4, 5 times already that regardless, it's competitive, that's fine, or sealed bid, or sole source, any of them, of the formal processes. Do we need to document every procurement? Yes. Haven't we seen that about 6 times throughout different citations? Phrased differently, perhaps, but saying the same thing. Documentation for every procurement activity. And here it is again, competitive procurement. It's the most simple process, but it needs to be documented in the same way, regardless of cost. Regardless of cost. Paper clips for the office, or hammers out, for the home building that you're going to use for home building construction, in the field type of purchase, regardless of the product, regardless of the service, regardless of the dollar value, we are supposed to document our procurement, whether it's a competitive process, a sealed bid, or the fourth one here. They call it non-competitive. It's also known as sole source or single source. It can be awarded. Now, according to the feds here, look at how they describe it. It can be awarded if one or more of the following circumstances apply. The number one gets into that small purchase of $250,000. Quite frankly, I'm not sure anyone who spends more than $250,000 on any one piece of procurement. But anyway, that's one of their requirements. Second one is the item is only available from one source. It's a unique item. Only one vendor makes it. Or the third situation, there's an emergency situation. In my neck of the woods, it's a tropical storm or a hurricane, flooding being the most prevalent aftermath of those situations. And sometimes it's difficult. Companies, businesses close down. It's difficult to get products and services. So you go to a sole source. Federal agency gives you permission. That is the fourth one. The fifth one, after attempting and searching and researching, you determine that it's impossible to get a competitive to go to the competitive route. You go with a sole source because, and we did this at the Native Learning Center, because the vendor was timely with a quality product, and also because the particular product that we were trying to procure was unique and it was special in some regard, and it fit the unique needs of us. So those are all reasons, documentable reasons for sole source, or as they call it, non-competitive procurement. So all of this is in section 320, along with, this should have been highlighted in red up at the top, 321, contracting for small business and minority business, women business enterprises. And now they've added in as a focus area, suggested focus area, veterans. So veteran-owned businesses, along with small and minority businesses, women business enterprises. We are encouraged to try to do our sealed bid process and our competitive and sole source procurement through these organizations, small, minority, women's business, and now veterans businesses. We are encouraged to do. It's not required, but we are encouraged. We're also encouraged, as it says down below in 322, we talked about this early yesterday, the Buy American domestic preference for procurement. There are some stipulations there, as you can see in the bottom, number 1 and number 2. Produced items such as iron and steel, and manufactured products of aluminum, plastics, the aggregate for concrete, some not glass, but fiber optical, and lumber. We are strongly encouraged to purchase domestic specifically for those items. Okay. So that's domestic preference for procurement, and it's stated right there. This is section 323, procurement for recovered materials. Not really going to get into that. Not so much here. These are bonding requirements of using a sealed bid. Your contractor must have 3 different bonding levels: bid guarantee, performance bond, and a payment bond. That's pretty straight. That has not changed. Not really going to get into this one. Financial reporting. This is more agency driven. Not going to concern with. I'm going to hover here though, because along with the procurement that we just did, 320, and along with 303 and 302, remember 303 was internal controls, 302 was financial controls. This is another one of the major requirements coming out of Subpart D. 2 CFR Part 203-29, monitoring and reporting program, states that we must monitor our activities in sync with 2 CFR Part 203-02 internal controls to assure compliance, as it says in that citation, and we must have a formal monitoring process. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but you should have, as it says in that first blue bullet in the red box, monitoring by you, the recipient must cover each of your federal programs. It must cover the 3 pillars: your operation, your financial activities, and your compliance, right? And you must do that on a regular basis. Check with your funding source. HUD, with its Indian Housing Block Grant, requires it once a year. Do it at the end of the program year, which was done at the Native Learning Center in conjunction with its year-end report called the Annual Performance Report, or APR. It was submitted with that report to HUD along with that annual report. Now, I don't want to say it's a problem, but why would, the question is why, knowing you have to do this, why would you wait till the end of the year and send in a report with a hope and a prayer and a dream that everything is running smoothly? I would think that you would want to take a proactive approach. If we have to monitor our program to make sure we have all our internal controls in place, you'd want to do it on a more frequent basis than annually, maybe semi-annual or even quarterly. And if you're doing it, let's say quarterly, those first 3 quarters of the year, Q1, Q2, and Q3, would be considered internal. They would be internal documents, like an internal audit that you would do yourself, self-monitoring. And that way, if you find any consistencies, you can treat them, fix them immediately without having to put that on your formal report that's done at the end of the year. By the time you get to the end of the year and you're filling in the mandatory report done, as it says here, you want to make sure that thing is crystal clear, clean, pristine. And the only way you can do that is to troubleshoot by doing mock versions of it once, twice, 3 times scattered throughout the year. I hope this makes sense. You're doing it periodically, intentionally looking for discrepancies, monitoring for discrepancies so you can find them, correct them. So when you do the final report for the whole year, at the end of the year, it's clean, it's pristine. That would be my goal. And following this, it doesn't tell you how frequently do it. It doesn't tell you how to do it, right? Here's another one. It doesn't tell you how to monitor. It just says you have to monitor. And you have to make sure you're in sync with all the policies and procedures and protocols and et cetera, but it doesn't tell you how to go about it. Now, I know from experience that HUD has templates on their website for self-monitoring of the Indian Housing Block Grant, and they come in 11 different sections. Some of them might pertain to your daily operation, some don't. But you can, in the case of HUD, you can go to their website, you can download those templates for self-monitoring. You can pick and choose the ones that fit your daily operation, and even then you can tweak them to fit your uniqueness, your unique operations. You're following me? You can do that. You want to look for something like that with your funding agency. Or if you wish, you could even go to HUD and borrow theirs, download them and just change the focus of them, follow their format. And, we did the same thing. So if you wish, send me an email or send an email to Brooke or reach out to Native Learning Center and ask for information on the self-monitoring template. And I will send you, that'll come to me, it'll work its way to me, and I will send you information that this is of interest to you on a template that you can manipulate or direct you to the HUD templates that are there that you also can manipulate and to fit your needs and follow their protocols there, or follow their, not so much their protocols, but their examples. And I can get that to you. I think that would be useful. Yesterday, we talked about retention of records. Very important, especially if we're segueing from, and the agencies, of course, are getting this pressure too. Remember, they're being told retainage of records, move out of paper trails, move more towards electronic record keeping. They in turn are telling us to do the same. Now, this particular citation retention, 3 years, I don't think it's caught up yet. I think the next generation of change to the uniform guides, you're going to see that ramp up because we're moving more towards electronic record keeping. It's easier to retain those records long term. So I think we're going to see 3 years turn into more like 7 years, which would be par with the Internal Revenue Service, or even more, 10 or even 15 years, since it's electronic documents. So that's going to be a spinoff, I think, of moving. Right now, the letter of the law is 3 years for record retention, whether it's hard after the close of the program year, whether it's paper or whether it's electronic. But if you're like me in any way, I'm keeping them indefinitely. I'm suggesting to leadership that I work with, plan ahead. This is the trend. Keep those records indefinitely. Don't destroy anything. If you've got paper, if you can, try to scan it so you can start making the transition from paper to paper and electronic. And then at some point, fiscal year 25 or fiscal year 26, transition 100%, if you haven't already, to electronic record keeping. This is the trend. This is where it's going. The medical industry and the hospitality industry are light years ahead of us on this. They've been doing this for years. Electronic medical records are light years ahead of us on this. And now we're starting to see it, and it's still in its infancy. 3 years is nothing. You know, even IRS has 7 to 10 years for our personal, our 1040s and things like that, our personal tax returns. Okay. All right. Okay, I want to stop here. Remedies, this real sweet name here, remedies for non-compliance, is a misnomer. It's really something you need to be aware of. Remedies for non-compliance, 2 CFR Part 339 states that the non-federal entity, that's us, fails to comply with those regulations that we've been mandated to follow. You know, the legislation, the regulations, terms and conditions. If we don't follow them, here's where we get ourselves into trouble. What can happen? The little screenshot on the right, if you can read it, is from Subpart C, where it also talks about this. It's like the sister citation. It specify what your agency can do, what they call a remedy. Such a nice name. Remedy for our non-compliance. They can do damage to us. At the bottom on the right there, underneath that red line, it says they can withhold proceeds. They can require additional or more detail. They can make you do more reports. They can require more monitoring. They can force you to go take special training, go out and spend money for specific training. They can also hold your funding. They can also debar you. There's all kinds of things. And depending upon the severity of it, we also have civil and maybe even criminal prosecution. So we don't want to get into this realm. We'll talk about it again in Subpart F. That's the auditing, the bad side of auditing, the findings and the management decisions and all those kind of things that we really don't want to talk about. Here's where they're specified. So if you want to reference, 339 is the citation, 208 specific conditions. Those are the things they can do. So these two citations work hand in hand. So does 340 there. Another phrase we don't want to hear states that the federal award may be terminated in whole or in part by the awarding agency if you, as the recipient, fail to comply with the terms and conditions. There's other ways to get there too. A poor history of audits, a lot of findings and unresolved findings on your audit, program reviews that were poorly not conducted, that you scored poorly on. Those can mismanagement of funds. All of those things can result in these remedies, conditions, termination, or just losing out of funding. Okay. No, and here's another, here's more. This is another one specifically. This is the same thing. Suspension and termination. This is, go back, this is like part 1, 2, 3. This would be the fourth area, talking about not following the protocols, not having internal controls, what the agency, what OMB can do to you. Suspension and termination of your program. Not really where we want to go ever. We want to do everything humanly possible in our control to avoid this. And that's part of the proactive approach, learning how to navigate, how to search, how to interpret, and how to implement these federal regulations, meet the letter of the law, and still interpret them in a way that work for us. So these are things we cannot change, suspension and termination, but we certainly can avoid them by being proactive. Okay, that is section D. Let's keep going. I'm going to skip the quiz and go right into another section here for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll take a break. We'll be at the top of the hour in 15 minutes, and we'll take a break because we got this one and one more section I would like to get through of the updates. All right, we are in the fifth part of the uniform guidance, and that is Subpart E, Cost Principles. Its full name is Cost Principles with Select Items of Cost. And you'll see what that means in a minute. But let's go through the citations first, or here's another poll number 3. Let's do that. Brooke, if you don't mind monitoring the answers here. How familiar are you with the cost principles of a uniform guidance? Do you know what expenses are allowable and unallowable, allocable and reasonable? Do you know what they are? A, I have no idea. Tell me more. B, I've heard of them, not sure the details. C, I know of them, could use a refresher. And D, I'm pretty good at it. Resident expert. What are your thoughts, folks? Give me an idea if you know what the cost principles are, where you can spend your money, federal funds, where you cannot.
It's pretty evenly mixed between A, B, and C. No D's yet.
Yeah, very few people, my educated guess is very few people know all of the, because, and they've changed some of this. So again, you're in the right place. We're going to go over this and walk through the citations first, and then we'll go into select items of cost. And I'll try to move through those quickly because there's several of them. Policy guide, application, nothing straightforward there. Composition of costs. I want to get to the meat of it. Here it is. Couple citations in factors affecting allowability of cost. And this is something we need to be aware of. It states that except where otherwise authorized by your agency, by the federal agency, costs must meet certain conditions right off the bat. And that is to become allowable, they must be necessary, reasonable, and allowable. And actually, they're saying allowable twice. They need to be allocable. So let's change on that first bullet. Necessary, correct. Reasonable, correct. And allocable. Cross out the word allowable and put in the word allocable, which means you can apply the cost to a line item budget amount. That's what allocable. It can be assigned to either a direct or indirect cost on your budget. That's allocable. Necessary to be allowable, they need to be necessary, reasonable, and allocable. They must conform to the limitations within this chapter, subpart E, which we'll get into, must be consistent with your internal controls, your policies and procedures, because trust me, when the auditors come in, when the programmer reviewers come from the agency, they're going to ask for your internal control, your written internal controls, your written policies and procedures, and then they're going to start looking at your financial transactions and your operational program and your compliance to make sure everything's in sync and that you do what you say you were going to do, if that makes sense. Okay, fourth bullet, B, accorded consistent treatment. That's compliance. Consistency, repetition, non-discriminatory. Fifth bullet, be in accordance with generally accepted accounting practices. And at the bottom, what does it say? Be adequately documented. Every single cost, which is going to be your procurement for the most part, must be documented. Okay. Again, we've got documentation. Okay. Here, we're getting into the first one. I said necessary, reasonable, allowable. I said circle those. Here's the first one. What is reasonable? According to 404, reasonable cost states that the cost is reasonable if, in its nature, does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time decision was made to incur the cost. Well, you can really tell that an attorney wrote this. Nothing against attorneys, but it's vague and there's a lot of words there and you got to read that and go, what does that mean? It means that reasonable cost, they're not going to tell you what reasonable cost is, because reasonable cost is subjective. It depends on what the circumstances are. Is it a sole source situation where you've got an emergency and you need to get a blue tarp put on the top of your building, and it's going to cost, that blue tarp's going to cost $1,000? Normally, that's about 10 times its normal value, but right now it's reasonable because you can't get the darn thing anywhere because of the situation. All of a sudden, reasonable takes on a different meaning. So we have to define what reasonable is. That's what I'm getting to. We determine, we as the recipient of federal funds here, we're interpreting now again. We're crossing over the navigating and searching for regulation, and we're taking it to the next level and trying to wrap our heads around what does it mean by reasonable. If all our costs, as it says in that first blue bullet there, they mean to be necessary, reasonable, allowable, but you don't tell me what reasonable means. Ordinary and necessary for the operation of the recipient. Okay, ordinary and necessary. Two more vague terms. So we determine for definition of reasonable cost in our policies and procedure, reasonable cost means ordinary and necessary. All right. So far, we know they got to be ordinary and necessary. In our case, ordinary and necessary means that they're competitive. We've done our research, our due diligence, and they're normal. We would purchase them normally but there will be times, there will be exceptions when reasonable cost means whatever we can get our hands on, basically, from time to time. So this one is, even though reasonable cost, they've got some verbiage here. What they're really saying is, as I'm looking at this, is it's up to you. Does it have a fair market value according to you? Is it ordinary and necessary according to you? Is it reasonable according to your expectations of your unique needs? So you need to kind of define this reasonable cost. Don't just rely on the feds here to tell you what reasonable cost is, because they don't. Here's allocable. That was the other one I talked about. Reasonable, allocable. This one's a little more straightforward. Allocable means cost is allocable if the cost for the goods and service involved are chargeable or assignable to a cost objective on your budget, to a line item or to a cost objective, whether it's a direct cost or indirect cost, doesn't matter. Can it be applied? If it cannot be applied to a budget line item, then it's not an allocable cost. Now you're venturing into a gray area that probably an auditor would call you out on. They're going to be looking for the fact that all of your costs, all of your procurement was related in some way, related to your budget for that grant. So that's allocable. And then let me go back here. We talked about allowability. We're getting into allowable. We're going to be getting into allowable. But we talked about necessary, reasonable, and allocable. Okay. Then we get into this part here. 407 gets into prior written approvals. You can go to 407 if you wish. There's about 15 prior written approvals. That prior written approval is getting permission from your funder to do certain things, cost share, program income, revision to budget. I want you to circle this one because it's my understanding they're eliminating more than half of this criteria. They're eliminating a lot of the of the items you're supposed to seek prior written approval from your funding source from. I assume that cost sharing might be one of them, program income, another one that they're going to eliminate, which would be good for us. And it will allow us to operate our program more efficiently and effectively. So prior written approval is the requirement that we get approval from our federal agency. Mark that one as changing, the reducing, basically. And I hope that happens. There's some more of the prior written approval areas. Special consider. A lot of these things don't even apply to us. All right. Direct and indirect costs, that's also in this section, a definition of direct cost, which is more or less your program cost that could be identified specifically with a cost objective with a high degree of accuracy to the actual program. And then we got our indirect cost below, which is also a budget item. You know, overhead is included in that, and other direct costs can be included in there as well. And every grant's going to be a little bit different. For example, the Indian Housing Block Grant has a 20% indirect cost rate, not to exceed 20%. So that would include not only the overhead cost, the administrative cost of operating the program, but also other indirect costs that might be lumped in there in the areas of salary and benefits and some things like that, or at least a percentage of them. So we got direct costs and indirect costs that's spelled out. This is just more of indirect cost rate, just what I was talking about over on the right side. Administrative costs such as overhead and shared costs like shared costs from different tribal departments. We had paid part of the cost, which ended up on the administrative side for indirect cost, IT, legal, human resource, maintenance and grounds. We shared that ended up as part of our indirect costs. Plus, as you see in the bottom left there, the 20% rate that from the Indian Housing Block Grant. Not going to get into that. All right, here we're still in Subpart E, and this is the bulk of it. This is the second half of Subpart E, and this is what actually, let me get started here, then we'll take a break. From 2 CFR Part 200, 420 through 475, or 421 through 475, as it says down there in the bottom, are specific areas that we're supposed to be aware of, specific cost items. And we'll walk through them quickly because there's 50 plus of them. So I'm just going to get started, then we'll take a quick break and come back and finish those up. And then I'll point out a few that have changed, and then the last part will be on Subpart F, audits. So let's get started on here, touch on a couple of these before we break. Here's what it looks like. On the far left, we have the item of cost, that column there, advertising, alcohol, audit services, and bad debts, for example. In the middle, it gives us either a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Is it allowable? Is it unallowable? Or is it both? Where are the changes? So that's a little definition. These are little sound bites of the actual provision or citation, which is listed over in the right side column. You can look at these if you wish. You can go to 2 CFR Part 200.421 or 425 or 426 and so on if you want to do a deeper dive on each one of these. What you'll see on the subsequent slides are abbreviated. I've kind of caught the essence of each of these particular. For example, compensation and fringe benefits for payroll is several pages long. I didn't have the space to copy, cut and paste 17 pages on one particular cost item. So I did an abbreviated. But let's kind of work our way through here quickly. Normally, advertising and public relations, very specific according to the federal regulations. If you read it, it says it's allowable, but it's used only for the recruitment of personnel, like a help wanted ad, or for the RFP process of your sealed bid. That is advertising. That's the way that they recognize advertising. So you got to be careful how you throw or how you classify your purchase orders or your cost items to make sure if you're using the word advertising, you're not in violation of 200 2 CFR Part 200 421 that says advertising is used exclusively for two things: personnel recruitment and RFP advertising in like a newspaper or a publication, something like that. That's advertising according to them. Next one's alcoholic beverages, unallowable. Can't use a single dollar. There's a couple of them like that. Alcoholic beverages, one of them, cannot use the money, federal funds from any funding organization, any funding source, as far as I know, on alcoholic beverages. Okay, below that, Audit services, yes and no. Yes. Allowable audits required at or above the 750,000 K right now. I said that was going to go up to 1 million. Fine, when it does, up to $1 million. Um, the cost of soliciting and hiring an audit firm to do the single audit, if you are above the threshold, is an allowable cost. If you are below the threshold right now, if I'd say if you're receiving only 500,000 a year or less of federal funds, but you want to have a single audit, which is a very specialized audit for federal grant funds, that would be unallowable. You would not be allowed to spend your funding money, your grant funds on that because you are below the threshold. That's why they have the threshold listed there. You can go to two sources to read more about this, the Single Audit Act, which is legislation, or you can go to the 2 CFR Part 200 425 to read about it. And also you can go to Subpart F, which is the whole section dedicated to audits. It's in there as well. Okay. And then at the bottom, bad debts. Now, we're not talking, when I say bad debts, we're not talking about a bad, you made a mistake that you sent, for example, you cut a check and you send the check to the wrong tribal member in the wrong amount and you discover it, you have to do a stop check through the bank and the bank charges you a fee of $25. We're not talking about that. We are talking about, in this case, poor or maybe even fraudulent money spent in a fraudulent way, federal funds spent in a fraudulent way and receiving that's the bad debts they're talking about, using federal funds for poor investment strategies or something like that, and you get a penalty or a civil crime or something like that. That's a bad debt that they're talking about. So, okay, I'm at the top of the hour. Let's take another quick break. Let's take five or so minutes, come back 5 or 6, let's say 6 minutes after the top of the hour. In my time, it would be 3:06 Eastern time. Okay, so plan accordingly. See you in 5. Okay, here we are. Bonding costs, allowable collection of proper payment, allowable compensation of personal services and its twin uh, fringe benefits. Allowable, both of them are allowable. Compensation, of course, whether it's salaried or whether it's unsalaried, hourly, as long as it's related to the scope of work. Not a problem. Fringe benefits, generally speaking, allowable. You got to be a little careful with fringe benefits because if there's going to be something unique, it's going to end up in fringe benefits. So we got to make sure that the fringe benefits do not discriminate in any way, shape, or form, and everyone's allowable. The next one is conferences. Now, a lot of people will have asked me, we want to use federal funds for some kind of a staff recognition or something. And can we do that? And my answers always go back to the regulations here, to Subpart E, cost principles. Look at this particular area, which is called conferences, 2 CFR Part 200 432. It's allowable because the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is conferences they consider to be a kind of a catch-all phrase. It means a meeting, it means a retreat, it means a seminar, a symposium, it means a training like we're doing right now, whether it's virtual, a webinar, or on-site, personal, face-to-face, whether it's a workshop, or they even use the word event. Now, event, the word event is an open-ended word in and of itself. So you have an event with the primary purpose, and these are their words, not Vince's words, the primary purpose to disseminate technical information. What does that phrase mean? Disseminate technical information simply means that you have information on the program that's readily available that you can pass out to staff and attendees, whomever that may be. It could be a flyer about you, the program, or the funding that you're receiving. It could be a brief agenda of business before activity, that type of thing. So that's the phrase we're looking for. dissemination of technical information is open-ended, doesn't tell you what it has to be. But what it does say in this particular citation, which is interesting, it says the primary purpose to disseminate technical information beyond the non-federal entity and is necessary and reasonable, which means you got to keep the cost within reason for successful performance of the award. Now, here's another area that I find very, very interesting. It may include, these are specific words coming right out of the citation. It may include rental of facilities. It may include speaker fees. It may include cost of meals and refreshments, not alcohol, but refreshments in general. It may include local transportation, such as a shuttle bus or Uber rides or something like that. And it ends with this phrase, and other incidental items. Okay, what does that mean? They don't define what incidental items means. So it could mean whatever you decide it to mean, as long as it's reasonable and necessary to the performance of what you're trying to do, which is related to your mission and all that in your dissemination of technical information. So to answer the question, can we have some kind of an event at the end of the year that for morale building, just can't use that word morale. It's like cost sharing. They've struck in that word. But if you want to have some kind of team building or some kind of event at the end of the year, call it a retreat, a seminar, team building. You've got some technical information there on the program, maybe even an agenda. That's technical information. Can you provide catering services? Yes. Can you provide transportation services? Yes. Can you bring in a guest speaker? Yes. Can that guest speaker be a comedian? Yes, because it's a speaker nonetheless. You just want to call it a speaker, you know. And anything else associated with that event. That's what they mean by other incidental items. They don't tell you exactly what. So that's how we answer that question.
Hey Vince,
Yeah.
you have a question in the chat. Nikki's asking, are the conferences a new item that is allowable? And then I also wanted to give you a heads up, your camera's off.
Oh, camera's off. All right, let me get the camera on. Camera. I turned it off. I turned it. How about now? It's indicating on my end that it's on and it's flashing. Okay. Was the question, is the conference citation new? No. What is new within this particular area is a few years back, they didn't have the cost of meals and refreshments in there. Recently, they've added that. The prior update to the uniform guidance, they added meals and refreshments. But everything else has been there for some time. This is not new, no. If there is something new in here, I would have had it highlighted. But that one has been around a while. Good question, though. Construction, remodeling allowable, generally speaking. Depreciation of equipment allowable, following generally accepted accounting principles, yes. So cost incurred for depreciation of equipment as part of the normal depreciation process, not a problem. Equipment, yeah, allowable. We've got the 5,000, 10,000 issue here. I got it highlighted 5,000. We know that has increased. So that one I want to point out to you, fines and penalties, not the cost we were talking about before, the bad cost where we write a bad check, we have to stop it, we get a bank fee. Here we're talking about fines and penalties and damages and other settlements, using federal funds to bail you out of jail, for example, or using federal funds to pay penalties that have been financial penalties that have been put on you by the tribe or by your funding source. No, we cannot use federal funds for fines, penalties, criminal or civil damages. We can't do that. We're not supposed to use it for fundraising either. We can't use that word either. We're not supposed to do fundraising and use federal funds to cover the cost of fundraising. What other ones? The one I want to one of the new ones, let's see, idle, this one here should have been circled in red. Idle facilities, idle capacity. Now, generally speaking, unallowable, but there will be times when this can be allowable. And that would be probably at the same time you'd be using a sole source situation, where you have acts of nature coming in here, the tropical storms and the flooding that shuts down the building, shuts down your facility. You can't work on it because the windows are blown off or the roof is torn off or there's flooding damage. And in addition to an idle, that's called an idle facility. In addition to that, you got to send people home. That's idle capacity, one or the other. Now, they're saying you unallowable, but there are times with probably with prior approval that you can use your monies to pay the cost that you're incurring. And it would make sense that you can use some of your funds to put your building back to where it was, to make the repairs. If you don't have it from another source, you dip into your funding from your federal grant. You can do that with the Indian Housing Block Grant to a certain extent and bring your facility back up to where it's operational. And also, if you're sending people home and they have to work from home or work virtually from somewhere else, home or somewhere else, they're still on the payroll. You're using your federal funds to do that in the name of idle. It's still compensation and fringe benefits, but under the realm of idle capacity, if that makes sense. It can be done in this area. You may want to take a closer look at 200,446. Normal and cost of insurance and indemnification, yes. Intellectual property, yes. Interest earned, generally speaking, interest earned on you can actually, if the agency allows you to, part of your program income, if you're allowed to do it, can be through earnings of investments. If you have the money to invest, if you have a budget that allows you to do that, a lot of variables in there, but you can. In the middle, lobbying, of course, lobbying and influencing legislation, whether on a tribal level, local, state, or national level, or even on a global level, you cannot use federal funds to lobby or to influence legislation in any way, shape, or form. That's 200,450. Okay. General maintenance and repair on your facility, yes. Materials and supplies on the bottom, normal materials and supply cost, yes, regardless of the 5,000, 10,000 threshold. Membership in professional agencies or subscriptions for magazines or that type of thing, yes, those are allowable as long as they're related. Yeah, and they have nothing to do with lobbying, as it says there. Participant support cost, cost of stipends, travel allowances, registration fees on behalf of your trainees or participants, not employees. So if you have, for example, Native Learning Center might want to have a training program. We know training is allowable. It's part of the conference umbrella of different things that's allowable. We can bring in food. And if we wanted to bring in participants, which we always do, and we wanted to pay a stipend to them or pay their travel or pay for their hotel bill, this is saying we can do that and we can use federal funds to do that. As long as we have the budget to do it. Just because it says it's allowable and we can provide a stipend or per diem, that's what subsistence means, or travel allowance for airfare or car or Uber, and the registration fee, if we charged one to attend, those are all allowable expenses. But to be honest with you, we didn't have the budget for that. We couldn't have done it even if we wanted to. We don't have the kind of money in our budget to pay stipends for people to be able to pay their airfare. We can't afford to do that. The tribe was on their own to get to the Native Learning Center or however they meant to do it. We don't have participation line item in our budget, even though it's allowable expense. Plant security, yes, allowable to make sure that your security is safe, your facility is safe. that your assets are safe, that your employees, your tribal members are safe, the cost of security for that, surveillance, that type of thing, those are all allowable costs. There is some exception with the security cost. We talked about that yesterday, the audio visual and surveillance equipment. There is a warning, if you recall, one of the executive orders was not purchasing certain audio visual equipment. So you got to be aware of that and go back and take a look at that requirement. It is in the regulations. It is in Subpart C, the moratorium on surveillance equipment. Okay, participant costs, we talked about that. It's redundant. Professional service costs, that's going to be your consultants, maybe an architect or engineer. You could consider them professional services coming in to provide guidance or an actual service. Those are allowable costs as long as they're related. Proposal cost for preparing bids and proposals, that type of thing is part of your construction process to build new homes. Those proposal costs are allowable. So is printing, publication and printing cost in general, publication of manuals, training manuals. Native Learning Center was printing manuals all over the place, training manuals, that's a publication. And also in there, if it's not dedicated, is shipping. Shipping would be in there too. It might be separate, but shipping, printing, publication, those are all, and general handling. What that means is if you were going to have like a trade show and you were off site somewhere, you're hosting a trade show in Atlanta, and you're at one of the venues there, one of the big hotels, and you're shipping your materials, maybe your display booth, or like the Native Learning Center, you might have material to hand out. You might even have training material if you're doing any type of training there. You ship it there, so there's going to be a cost for shipping, whether it's on one of the big rigs or UPS or whatever, there's a cost for shipping. And then sometimes there's a cost for handling. And that is the group, I think they're the Teamsters that are in some of the union controlled cities. And the venues have the Teamsters who do the handle. They literally take the material off the truck and bring it into the warehouse or bring it into the convention center or where it is. That's handling. Those are separate costs along with shipping. So you need to be aware of that. All of that fits in public. Those are all legitimate costs. Rearrangement, reconversion of your facility. If there's a problem with it, if, they're not talking your basic wear and tear and depreciation. They're talking about converting something because something happened, not related to wear and tear. Recruiting cost, here's another one where it's allowable, but if you probably might not have the money for this. Here they're saying in 463 allowable for placing help wanted ads and for actually the cost of relocating people who you are in an interview process with, and they live in the state next door, and you want to bring them into your corporate office. You want to put them up for the night. You want to give them a per diem stipend. This is called recruiting costs. This is a new venture getting in. This is relatively new, this whole recruiting cost. And just because you can do it and it's an allowable cost doesn't mean you have the budget for it. That is something that it's very personal. So now here's another one where the feds say you could do this and it's an allowable cost if you have the money in your budget and if your tribe does not have a protocol against doing something like that. Relocation, that goes hand in hand. Recruiting and now relocation costs of employees. This one, recruiting, was for potential employees. This one at the top is for actual employees that you want to relocate to another city, another county, another state. And here again, we've got permission to use monies for that allowable cost, but that can get very expensive for relocating people, putting them up in a hotel, and providing for the family, not just for the employee. Those things are apparently all allowable, but if you got to have them in your budget. Can you see a little bit of a trend here? There's a little bit of a trend coming here that the OMB is moving towards family oriented without saying it. They are embedding family oriented activities in here, aren't they? Relocation costs, recruiting costs. I think there's another one in here. We might come across it. Um, they're kind of trying to make the notice of funding opportunity more user friendly and readable. They're trying to put a softer approach in here and open this up to be more family oriented without saying so. And these are two examples. This one, recruiting and relocation, are new, and they go beyond the normal operational cost allowances. Rental cost, rental property, allowable, selling and marketing cost, unallowable. That's because they have specific categories. Advertising for the recruiting of people or for your RFP, and then public relations, which we saw a couple slides back. Taxes allowable, your normal payroll taxes, taxes that you incur on a regular basis. Telecommunication cost, here's the one that's allowable and unallowable. Normal telecommunication and surveillance equipment, yes, we need to protect our building, protect the assets, protect our people. So we do need surveillance equipment, low voltage cable, the service agreements for an also audio visual equipment would fall in here. That's all allowable. What's unallowable, as it says, are certain companies that we're not supposed to purchase these from. And you can go to 471, 200, 471 to get more details on that. And the very bottom one, travel costs. Normally, yes, transportation costs for airfare or for bus. If you're going by bus, I don't know if anyone goes by bus anymore. Uber, Lyft, all those ground ride share, hotel shuttles if there's a fee for it, lodging, normal lodging, cost of lodging at GSA rate or above GSA rate if you could justify it, and as long as it's in your budget. Okay, that is section E. All right. So what I'm gonna, okay. Let's see. Oops. Allowable cost states that a cost is allowable if the goods or services involved are blank to the cost objective in accordance with relative benefits received. A, more than 10,000, less than 250,000. B, inexpensive and attainable. C, chargeable or assignable. Or D, of good quality and delivered on time. They're all good, some good answers. But really, it's this one. They are chargeable. That's the way that the feds look at it. Chargeable and assignable to a budget. Okay. All right. We are approaching the last section. My goal would be to get through this. Everything after this is going to be redundant of what we've already covered. So, Brooke, a heads up when we get to the end of this, which would be 2 CFR Part 200, 521. There's only 21 of these. Then we'll be done. So just a heads up there. We should finish right at the top of the hour, 4 p.m. my time, Eastern. So let's walk through these 21 requirements, audit requirements. I'm pointing out where things have changed. These are the requirements that you would have, that the auditor would have, and what the agency would have. Audit requirements. We talked about this. Currently, it's 750,000 or more. They've increased that to 1 million. So you have to figure out if you are eligible now for what's considered a single audit. Basis, that's 501, audit requirements. Audit 2, basis for determining federal awards, not is. I'm going to skip over, those are unrelated stuff. Here's where we want to get into some more detail. Things that would apply to us more directly. 504, frequency of audits. Must be normally done on an annual basis, either dedicated for your program or part of the tribe. If it does it for a series of different departments, that's fine. As long as you're doing it on a regular basis, either annually or semi-annually. We talked about sanctions. Remember, we talked about debarring and holding back on funds. The agency can do this if we have non-compliance issues that are unresolved or findings that are unresolved. Here it is again in subpart F. 505 sanctions states that in cases of continued inability or unwillingness to have an audit in accordance with this part, or basically, or numerous findings that have material discrepancies. That phrase, material discrepancies, is a word you never want to hear from your auditor. That means you have serious problems. Federal agencies can take action as provided and in 200-338, which we looked at, remedies for noncompliance, such as temporarily withholding cash payments pending correction of the deficiency, or partially or wholly suspending or terminating the federal award, or initiate suspension or debarment proceeds. So it can happen, it can be triggered by the audit team coming in. So that's why it's here in this section. Audit costs, talked about that. They're allowable, generally speaking, they're allowable if you meet the threshold. It says 506 here, audit cost states that reasonable, proportionate share of the cost of the audits required by and performed by in accordance with the Single Audit Act as implemented by requirements of this part. Yes, got that. The following audit costs are unallowable. Any cost of auditing that is exempt from having an audit. What that means is the example I gave you before, your funding is less. Right now, your funding is less than 750,000 per program year, but you still want the single audit. Well, you're not at the threshold yet, so the cost you would incur for a single audit and not being, at the threshold, that would be an unallowable cost. And you'd end up having to refund that back to the funder or something worse. Program specific audit, that's the single audit. States that some cases the program specific or single audit will be available to provide specific guidance. And down below, you're the auditee. Auditee responsibility states that you must procure and arrange for the audit, you or the tribe or whomever, and prepare the appropriate financial statements and make them available to the audit team. The auditor, the auditee, that's you, must provide the auditor with access to personnel, to your accounts, to your books, to your records, whether they're hard copy or electronic, any supporting documents, your procurement, your compliance, everything, basically, everything. The auditee must promptly follow up and take corrective action on any audit findings. Well, hopefully that bottom blue bullet you never find yourself in. You must take action that's correct on audit findings, but hopefully you don't have audit findings because you have taken a proactive approach. All right, auditor selection, that's up to you. It's allowable with parameters. Financial statements, you've got to make those available. Must prepare the financial statements in accordance with GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Make them available. You do know when the audit team comes in, they look at more than just financial statements. They're going to want to talk to people who are in the department or under the realm of the grant. So they're going to want to talk to personnel. They're going to want to look at the financial records, and they're also going to want to make sure your compliance is in sync. So they're going to look at those three pillars of your internal controls: operations, financial activities, and compliance. And they're going to want to see your written internal controls and your written policies and procedures, and then they're going to start their audit. One of the things I would strongly advise that you do with them, if they're going to be on your site and you're involved in the audit, is ask for a pre-audit meeting. Sit down with the audit team if you can, your team and the audit team, to make sure that they understand how your program operates. Don't assume that they do. Make sure that they understand the ins and outs. That's what we discovered a few years back at Native Learning Center. We had an audit team come in from one of the big firms that the tribe had set up. They were doing several departments, including ours. We sat down and found out that the respective auditors did not know how the Indian Housing Block Grant worked. That was a major discovery on our part, and we insisted that we take the time to educate them before they start the audit on how the program works and how we apply it on a local level within. So word to the wise, little best practice tip, make sure the audit team, whoever it is, and this is especially important if they're conducting the audit off-site. And look, like they've been doing recently with our situation, they sometimes literally don't come to the office, but you still want to make sure they understand how your program works, the ins and outs of your program. So there's no assumptions on anyone's part. Hopefully you'll never be in this situation, and that's a follow-up, a follow-up to a finding. Hopefully your preactive or proactive approach to the situation, make sure everything is where it's supposed to be and your policies and procedures are up to date so you don't have a finding. Your self-monitoring is being done on a regular basis more than annually. You're doing it perhaps quarterly, looking for discrepancies so that you can resolve them internally before it ends up as a finding on your audit and or on your self-monitoring report that you're submitting to your funding source if you have to do that. It says, states that the auditee is responsible for follow-up, or another phrase we never want to hear, corrective action. A corrective action plan is just that, a finding that was not resolved. Here's the best case scenario. If you have that pre-audit meeting with the auditors, making sure they understand how your operation works, you also want to ask them that if they do find either a real or perceived discrepancy in your operation, in your financial activities, in your compliance, that they approach you with it before it is entered into the audit process, audit program. That would be the best case scenario. So you can address the discrepancy or the issue before it is integrated into the audit. We don't want to have an audit finding. So the best case scenario is to have an open discussion with them and communication throughout the audit that if they do find something, that they approach you. And if it's fixable, try to fix it immediately. Second best scenario would be if they discover something that they come to you. The second best scenario is you can't fix it immediately, but you will fix it before the audit is over, conducted, and certainly before the audit is filed with the audit clearinghouse, which is the repository of all federal audits. That's where the federal agencies go to download your audit, the audit clearinghouse. So second best scenario is fixing it before it goes, before it's entered in ink, so to speak, before it's integrated into the report, and certainly before it's submitted to the audit clearinghouse. And then the third scenario, which is not really a scenario at all, it is the last resort in that you can't resolve it either before they leave or before they submit the grant. It will end up as a finding, and you'll have to do a corrective action plan. You want to do that as quickly as possible if you're forced to take that it gets to that point. So that's what this is talking about, audit findings follow-up. Make sure that you follow up and put in motion those proactive steps to try to mitigate and minimize the chance that there is a discrepancy that turns into a finding. Okay, you don't want that. Here's that audit clearinghouse I was talking about. This is where your audit's going to go. The report submission of your completed audit must be completed and submitted within the earlier of 30 calendar days after receipt of the auditor's report or 9 months after the audit period. Okay, they got 30 calendar days to submit it after they're done writing it to the audit clearinghouse, and or they've got a 9-month period after the close of your audit. So if you're on a fiscal year and your program period ends September 30th, you're in the queue to have an audit. They usually start after the first of the year, but they have a 9-month window to do the audit, complete the paperwork, and submit it to the audit house audit clearinghouse in 9 months. So that would give them until what, September 30th, September 29th, somewhere in there, depending upon the 9 month, September 30th at the drop dead latest to get it to the clearinghouse. So you've got that time frame to work with. If there are any findings, if you have a clean audit, no worries. It's only when we get into discrepancies. Get into that. Scope of audit, the single audit's going to be following, the auditors are going to be following what's called the generally accepted government auditing standards. And of course, you're following generally accepted accounting principles. Okay, audit report. This is their report. This is their responsibility. They must include an opinion. That's standard tax return, standard audit, the auditor's opinion onto whether your financial statements, internal controls, and compliance are represented fairly in all material respects without any findings. That is what's referred to as a pristine audit, no findings. This is what we're going for. Everything we've learned so far over this 2 days is helping us set up to make sure we do this and avoid findings and material to avoid this audit findings. The auditor must report any audit findings in their report, in their schedule, if any, and any questions at questionable cost. These are phrases we do not want to hear from the auditor. Significant deficiencies, material weaknesses in internal controls, non-compliance with statutes. These are phrases we do not want to hear, let alone audit findings. Audit, we want to do everything humanly possible, proactive, to make sure that we eliminate any possibility of these negative scenarios, deficiencies and weaknesses and non-compliance. Audit documentation. We got three or four more to go here. Audit documentation states that the auditor must retain audit documentation. They must retain records for 3 years. So there's that 3-year thing again. Trust me, they keep them longer. They scan them and they keep them much longer than a 3-year period. They're beyond, they go beyond that. Major program determination. This is something you need to be determined. Are you low risk or high risk, basically, from an auditing program review standpoint? Here's where it's spelled out. You can go to Subpart F 518, major program determination. This is what the auditors are using to determine if you're a type A or low risk, or type B and high risk. Type B and type A, 2 ways that they measure that. One is the dollar amount of funds that you receive per year, not the threshold to trigger the single audit, the 750 or a million. Down below in the green, those dollar amounts down there. To be considered high risk, you would have to be receiving huge amounts of federal funds per agency, at a minimum 25 million up to, as you can see in the bottom right, over $20 billion. I don't know of many Indian tribes or tribal entities that receive that kind of money, but keep in mind, federal funds are also dispersed, awarded to the United States military that does receive 20 billion or 100 billion, or maybe even more than that. So they would automatically, anything in that green area is going to be considered type B and high risk. Anything below that, which I think would include most organizations, tribes, nonprofits, and others, would be considered low risk. So from a financial standpoint, from an dollar award amount per year, you're going to be considered low risk. Where tribes and tribal entities and nonprofits run into problems, it's the second category, and that is if you have prior findings, which we just talked about, or poor program reviews from the agency, or a history of problems that are being reported to your federal funder. Now, that's another thing they look at too. It's not just the dollar amount they receive, but your track record of performance. And this, as we know now, this is getting more and more data driven, right? We're moving in that direction. But so the auditors and your agencies are looking at two things. The auditors in particular are considering you low risk or high risk. You're going to be low risk if you're under that $25 million dollar threshold, which is most likely, and you have a clean record of program reviews and prior audits. If you have any findings that are unresolved, and because they'll follow you just like filing for bankruptcy. They'll follow you from year to year to year. So if you have unresolved findings or other major discrepancies, that also will trigger you as a high risk candidate. And what that means is the auditors are going to come in, they're going to, with a fine tooth comb, with a very well sharpened microscope, and they're going to look deeper. They're going to ask for more, and you're not going to have the assurance that you'll be given the benefit of the doubt like a lot of type A low risk candidates are. So we want to do everything in our power to qualify as a type A and stay there, right? Don't want to be a high risk candidate because we have a prior history of findings or unresolved findings or poor program reviews from the agency. It should be everything you can do to avoid that. Reducing risk. Everything these days is about this. The auditors are looking for risk, cybersecurity risk, like we talked about yesterday. What is the level of risk? That's a burning issue, not just in our industry with the uniform guidance, but with all industries because of the rampant problem with risk, cybersecurity, fraud, identity theft, all kinds of different things are adding to this. Also, that relates to us directly, and I mentioned the first one, current and prior audit experience could indicate a high risk, weakness in internal controls or poor interpretation of internal controls in your policies and procedures could do that, or prior or prior program reviews is what it should say. Prior program reviews that are poor program reviews done in the past by the agency, if you had any, also can contribute to moving you from low risk to high risk. When you always start at low risk, but we certainly don't want to move up that escalator to high risk. Yeah, right. We talked about this. Yeah, more on the low risk. See, it's really critical in the audit thing. They're all about risk and making sure you're a low risk candidate. And this last one here is the area like major deficiencies and findings. We don't want to do this. The management decision is a situation that you would find yourself in, or your leadership would find themselves in if a finding goes uncorrected. That would lead to what's called a major decision where you have to do a corrective, or you or the leadership, someone has to do what's called a corrective action plan. You tell the auditors and subsequently tell your funders how you're going to resolve the problem long term. That's what the management decision is. States that the auditee, that you must clearly state whether or not the audit finding is sustainable, the reasons for the decision, and the expected action. And it might result in having to repay disallowed cost. It might result in making financial adjustments to your operation or some other. It might end up in termination, reduction of your budget cost. I don't know. We don't want to put ourselves in this, force ourselves into these negative situations. So again, we are done here. We move, and we are very close to the top there. I want to just close out. I'm not going to go into part 4 because it is redundant. It talks about the things that we already discussed and in detail. We talked about operation and how important that is in all different, from a compliance standpoint, from an audit standpoint. We talked about operation, financial activities, and compliance. You saw the resources. They were up at the beginning of the program, way up at the top left, resources. We talked about those. So pretty much, Brooke, skip that last quiz. I am done. I'm done here. I'm going to stop sharing because we're not going into that section. Brooke, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close it out. Thank you, everybody.